Welcome to Not Entirely Unlike Tea with Christine Collins. Hey there, it's Christine Collins, and I have a fun topic for us today around looking at and having a little fun asking some questions about whether certain things are magic or science. And I think it's fun to kind of tease this apart a little bit, look at where the pieces of science are that we have for certain things, and perhaps where there may be some room for more growth to happen. Now, it's not unusual at all for many of us to have intuitive nudges or to experience moments where we feel like we have an insight that doesn't seem to be coming from something solid or concrete. Intuition itself is related to the ability to have knowledge or insight or awareness without necessarily having a logical explanation or analysis as to why we form that conclusion. It can be connected to things like differences in patterns in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the anterior insula that have to do with intuitive processing. There's also a tie-in there to sensitivity, and sensitivity as it relates to sensory processing. So increased sensitivity to things in the environment, to sights and sounds and textures, where sensory data is processed in a deeper way, and we can become more easily overwhelmed by those things. And that may connect to differences in neurotransmitter patterns, and also tie into emotional sensitivity and empathy, where some people are just a little bit better at recognizing and responding emotionally to emotional states in other people. And that goes back to differences in structure and function in the brain, particularly the amygdala, which is responsible for our emotional processing, our social interactions, our social interpretation of emotional things in the environment and other people. And of course, there can be many other variables that factor into intuition, life experience, the ability to be introspective, to reflect and process information, cultural relevance and belief systems, and where and how we process information as we're taking it in. And what's interesting is that we have an awareness of some things that our brain is picking up or that our senses are perceiving, such as being able to perceive a visual, a color, or to feel a texture or a sensation. But actually, the brain is collecting lots and lots of pieces of information and periphery information at all times, recording bits and pieces, consolidating that information, processing all of it, and forming conclusions based upon knowledge that we already had, based upon previous experience, and based around whatever story we are telling in our mind, usually happening below the surface that we're not necessarily aware of, but the story that we carry about what life is, what we are, what other people are, and trying to fit those sensory details into that existing story and collective. Now, one of the aspects of intuition comes out of a capability of recognizing patterns and being able to quickly make associations between different patterns. Neuroscientifically, that happens between the visual cortex and more specifically the inferior temporal cortex that's responsible for things like recognizing an object and processing visual information. There's also emotional processing, and the emotional processing piece ties heavily into the story that we are carrying, and our amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, helps with processing emotional stimuli and taking all of those different pieces of information and consolidating down into the meaning behind it, which then allows us to make decisions based upon what we've pulled together from the experience. Now, if the intuitive nudge comes in the form of a somatic experience in the body, where there's kind of an integration between emotional and cognitive information, that starts to tie in things like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and allows us to experience that deeper knowing, the sensory information that's coming in towards us in a bodily way. So getting a feeling in your stomach, kind of a pit in your stomach, or feeling the hairs raising on your arms, or various other types of sensory bodily sensation. And what I think is very interesting about this is that those of us who have had an experience of intuition experience in a felt sensory way. It is a lived experience. So going back to that concept of lived experience, where we remove out things like the objective reality, the description through lingo, the terminology, and boil it back down to the sights, the sounds, the taste, the touch. Experiencing intuition is quite different from us stepping back and speaking about it from this stance neuroscientifically. But what I think is so interesting about this and so relevant about this is that there are some things that can currently be explained by science and by neuroscience, and there are some features that can't yet be explained. And the way that I tend to look at it in most cases is that the two are not exclusive. I don't see any reason that if you believe in science, you can't also believe in magic as it stands to be the future of science, and vice versa, because I think we can invite the two in together to play and to coexist. There are many experiences that we have that feel magical that do have some kind of scientific explanation, and that explanation develops and furthers itself over time with research. Things like identifying a particular token or symbol, or some people call it like having a sign, getting signs. If there's an image or a number or something like that you are highly focused upon for any reason, your reticular activating system is capable of picking up that information and making sure that you don't miss those things in your environment. This is partially a survival mechanism, that if there's a specific threat or a specific good thing that lends itself to the future of our survival, we'll be able to pay attention to it, whether it's accessing food and resources or avoiding becoming prey. So in many ways, it's one and both. And I think that when it comes to the notion of magic, in terms of simply being desire made real, so being capable of focusing your energy, harnessing your mind, harnessing your brain, maybe using tools like visualization or hypnosis or something else, being able to tap into and utilize the resources that are there, whether we're aware of them or not. And that can help us to let our goals unfold, to draw closer to the things that we're wishing for, and in a way that uses less energy and has less confusion. And we can use tools like flow state, for example. I think that's a great example of real-life magic. It just so happens that flow state can also be understood scientifically. So just in case you're not familiar with flow state, it's kind of known as being in the zone, being in a mental state where you're completely immersed in the activity that you're doing, especially if you're creating something. You're very focused and energized, but there's also a layer of calm detachment and a very high level of enjoyment. You're deeply involved, excited, and eager about the activity. There's dopamine release, and that's connected highly to motivation, to pleasure, to enjoyment. It's the reward system. There's also a noted deactivation in the frontal lobe, which ties to things like second-guessing yourself, self-doubt, being self-critical, conscientiousness, decision-making, and therefore that deactivation is kind of reducing thoughts that can be distracting, thoughts that lead to more self-consciousness, thoughts that lead you to start worrying, is this good enough? Are they gonna like it? Is this any good? Is this terrible? So that portion of your brain is actually deactivated and lessened, allowing you to lower your inhibitions around creating. So if you're creating some form of art, you're writing some form of content, when you are in a flow state, there is less self-consciousness that can slow down the creation process. Now, flow state is measurable on fMRI, so it's not a made-up thing, even though it is a felt experience for many people. It's observable as well. There's an increase in connectivity between various different brain regions, which allows us to form connections that we might not otherwise be capable of making when we're not in a flow state. So being able to relate your work to some really cool pop culture reference, or being able to find the perfect cartoon that perfectly suits your message, being able to create something in a way that really captures the heart of what you're trying to get at, finding the perfect words or phrases. It can feel like a magical experience if you've ever had that happen for you. And people who create regularly, writers and artists, have had this experience, and it can be very frustrating when you can't get into that flow state, when it feels like every word you're writing is a battle, versus when it's like you've unleashed something and it's all just flowing and moving very smoothly. It's kind of like the content writes itself. And I think that sometimes we can get very caught up in the strategy side of content creation, knowing that we're trying to get our message tailored in a very specific way to a specific audience. And that's all well and good. There's nothing wrong with some strategy, but sometimes we can get so caught up in trying to get it so specific and perfect and strategized and optimized and SEO'd and all of these different things that we can really lose touch with the creativity aspect of creating. And that flow state is associated with being in the alpha brainwave, which is a brainwave that we can achieve on our own. We can get to there through hypnosis, through visualization, through various different meditation tools, yoga nidra. There's a lot of different ways that you can intentionally create that flow state for yourself. So finding things that are enjoyable, activities that maybe challenge you a little bit but are actually within your skill level. If it's too difficult or if it's too easy, it can be more difficult to get into a flow state. So figuring out kind of where your skill set lies and staying in a zone that suits you, that is your zone of genius, but stretches you just a little bit so that you have an opportunity to go into that expansiveness. Allowing yourself the actual time and space. Sometimes we're creating under duress, and sometimes we don't have a choice about that. But when you do have a choice about that, it can be extremely helpful to actually create space in your calendar for creation to happen. We've also talked in previous episodes about how sometimes we get our best ideas randomly in the shower or taking a walk or falling asleep. And so I've talked at length about how to manage that situation. But the reason why those things happen for us is because we tend to be in a flow state when we're more relaxed. And so you can choose that intentionally by doing deliberate activities that cause relaxation of your mind to occur, and then have it set up to create your content or your art or your writing in that space immediately following your relaxing activity. And then obviously deciding the right way to take breaks, the right timing for you. And there's not necessarily one right answer. I know there's a lot of thinking out there about the perfect productivity protocols and exactly the right way to time yourself with doing it in 20-minute sprints or 25-minute sprints. But actually, flow state is much more about allowing and following than it is about strict, rigid lines. We do, however, need to create the space for flow to be possible. So allowing a certain amount of time to be available to you to create the things that you want to. And I really believe that creating art and music and poetry and writing and content of all forms is in itself a form of magic. It is imagination put into action. It is being capable of envisioning something in your mind and then bringing it into existence, taking a story or an idea or a thought process from your mind and putting it onto the page. So I would say that all of creation is magic. And there's, of course, neuroscience behind it. It's both. We are conjuring up something that did not previously exist in that exact form and bringing it out from the ethers and into tangible reality. So I hope you found this little discussion interesting, and I wish you the most magical and creative rest of your day. Thanks for listening. This is Christine Collins at transformcreate.com.